Hi there, welcome again to the Ivory Tower Collections. It's been a while since I've done a video, but I thought I'd do another tech video, and this time it's going to be working on a client's Intellivision that was sent to me. Now there's going to be a couple of things that end up getting done to this Intellivision, and I'm actually waiting for some of the parts. But basically, the client is wanting me to do a complete capacitor replacement on the Intellivision. And I'm also going to completely check it out and verify everything is working well. And then the main reason why it was sent to me is they want me to do a composite audio video mod to this console. But again, I am actually waiting for the rest of the parts for that. But since I hadn't actually done a video yet on an actual capacitor replacement, I thought that's what I would do in this video now. So, capacitor replacement. Well, there's really not a whole lot of capacitors to an Intellivision, which is a good thing. That makes it a little bit easier, of course, to do this. It's not as time consuming as some other items. So what are you going to need for tools to work on this? Well, as it turns out, the Intellivision is a pretty simple machine to work on. So the tools we're going to need is, of course, we're always going to need a standard number 2 Phillips or cross-tip screwdriver. Always got one handy for that. And you're definitely going to need some flush cutters or diagonal cutters, however you want to label them as. So you need a good set of flush cutters. And you'll probably need a good set of small needle nose pliers. Sometimes you just got to be able to hold on to something a little bit extra. And also, I've been using this quite a bit lately. It's my little tiny tweezers made by Excel, and these things are really sharp on the end. I don't know if I can get the camera to focus on that. Yeah, there we go, a little bit. But they're really good for picking up small items and holding on to them. And I found that they actually don't seem to conduct heat all that badly. So even if I'm holding onto a component leg as I'm soldering on something and need to be able to pull it or hold it in place, this works really well. So I might need that. I also like to keep an old toothbrush around. It's great for cleaning the residue and debris off the board, especially after you've desoldered. And sometimes when you actually do the resoldering of new components, you'll have little solder beads and things like that that kind of get away from you. Toothbrush is good to use to just kind of clean off and get some of that gunk off without doing any real damage, because of course it's fairly soft as far as the bristles go. Some other things that I will eventually need for this is I will also, if I can find it here, because it's clearly hiding from me right now. Here it is. It's over here. I might also need this X-Acto blade. Probably will need this to use for cutting away or scraping away some of these solder mask on the power supply board when I replace the capacitors on that. Other things to have on hand, which are handy, is to have some desoldering wick. I may or may not use this. I'm not a big fan of this, to be honest, and I know that sounds kind of weird for electrical type stuff, but I've just never had the greatest of luck using desoldering wick. But I keep it around because sometimes I do still use it from time to time. Of course, I will also need my trusty Heiko FR300 desoldering gun, desoldering iron, desoldering gun, however you want to call that. And my ever trusty Heiko 936 soldering station with the 907 soldering wand. So, those are the basic items I can think of right offhand that I'm going to need. I will probably also need, now that I'm thinking about it, my solder aid tools. Yes. Yeah, you're going to hear me saying solder instead of solder. I'm trying to get into the habit of it. Technically, it is pronounced solder, because there's an L in it. But yeah, we'll see. I'm sure I'm going to forget, and it'll just sound weird, and I'll probably sound like I'm trying to talk in some accent I don't actually possess. But probably need those as well. So, there it is. Oh, and of course, you can't do a capacitor replacement on a Intellivision without a capacitor kit or a set of replacement capacitors. And like most of my stuff, nice little plug here, I get all my stuff from Luke at Console 5, because they've got great stuff available and good prices, and he ships with amazing speed. So there we go. That's pretty much it. Let's take this thing apart and get to it. Yep. I'm gonna write my name, put my initials in it. There we go. What do you think? Think they'll notice? You know I'm going to clean this up anyway. Okay, so capacitor replacement is not too terribly difficult. The most difficult capacitors to replace are actually these two big beasts right here attached to the power supply board. And that is because they are axial capacitors, meaning that they have their posts or their leads on the opposite sides, kind of like a battery. Unfortunately, it's kind of difficult and expensive to get replacement capacitors of this type and size. So in the case of Console 5, his replacements are radial capacitors where you have the leads along the bottom. So I'll show you, there's a couple of ways that you can still install these even though these were axial. My method requires a little bit of modification to the power supply board. Very small amount of modification, but I think it looks cleaner and is a much better fit overall, but I'll get into that when we get there. Okay, so other things to do here. Well, I got some bugs. Again, my toothbrush comes in handy for this. This is the main power harness, AC power harness off the power transformer, or the isolation transformer here inside the Intellivision. And then we've got a common ground wire here that has to be taken loose, and a couple more screws, 2 to be exact. I'm going to set those over there where I know where they belong, and just about got the power supply board. Only thing left is there is a mylar ribbon cable that contains all the different voltages and ground from the power supply board to the main logic board underneath the EMF shielding here, or the RF shielding. So there's the main power supply board. As you can see, there's really only 3 electrolytic capacitors that have to be replaced on this. The 2 big ones I spoke of earlier, and this little guy in the center. Not too big a deal. Other things I like to do is I'll frequently take a look at the voltage regulators and just kind of clean them up a little bit, and perhaps apply some new thermal paste. It's always a good idea. Although these are in really good shape. This whole power supply almost looks like a brand new board, to be honest. Okay, there's nothing else holding the main logic board in place. It's just sitting in here. So I can just kind of lift it up on one side, and this will allow me to take the cables off for the controllers. And then I can just there we go, pull the main logic board assembly out, and that's it. That's all I need from it. I'll take the rest of this stuff, kind of throw it back in the case here for a bit, get this out of my way. It does have both RF shields. You've got the main one on the bottom. This is actually the bottom of the PCB. If you didn't know, Intellivision mainboards are installed upside down. And then the top has this large black RF shield as well that has to come off. And you need a high heat soldering iron to do this. In fact, I was negligent and did not have my soldering iron turned on. So I need to do that now, in addition to my desoldering iron. Turning on both of those right now. They won't take long to heat up at all. They only take about a minute. So yes, I'm going to have to get some solder. I could use my solder wick. I might try that, in fact. I told you I'm not very good with it, but you know, I'll try it. This is a perfect reason to use it and try to use it. To remove where these solder anchors are holding the 2 RF shields together over the main logic board. There's quite a few points like that. But I will need to get both shields off in order to be able to get to the capacitors and to change them out. So let's see here if my iron is ready. Yes, it is. get this back into view. Apologize for that. So there we go. Finally got that crazy shielding off of there. Now what I'll do at this point is try to get some of the solder maybe off the edges of this, or actually I might just leave it on there. It'll make it easier to solder it back on to the cover. So here's the main logic board. There's lots of what we call hot snot or hot glue that was put onto this thing to hold these heat sinks in place. Now what's interesting about this is this one's got a lot of heat sinks on it, but yet my actual Intellivision doesn't have hardly any heat sinks. And that's how it came. I didn't take them off. They just weren't there. I'm not sure what that was all about. Alright, so on this board we've got a few more capacitors, and this one's going to be kind of a booger. Let me just get a hold of it here. Get him raised up. There we go. But there's not a whole lot. I mean, I'm looking at this and honestly I see what looks like just 4 capacitors. Yeah. Now, these capacitors, similar to the other board, are also axial, and I've got radials to replace it, but the distance between the openings is small enough that I can still get the radials in there more or less and lay them down. So they'll work okay. So we've got that. That's only the top cover though. Remember I told you I have to get the bottom cover off too, and it is unfortunately still attached quite a bit. So I will try my desoldering braid again. Again, I'm not the best with this, but we're going to give it a shot. Oh, it was off. Okay. We got it. Just had to get a little better with it. So that looks pretty scary and nasty, and I just need to get that cleaned up. And then I'll hit it with some fresh solder. We got the bottom RF shield off. Finally. Okay. So you can see that it's kind of nasty looking right there from the additional rosin and flux that was left behind. So what I am going to do is get some alcohol, and I need a Q-tip. You can see it's a little better looking now. I got some of that gunk off of there. Took some of that blue marker off too from, I'm not sure who that was. Maybe an inspector of some sort that was checking these boards out at the end. All right, there's actually a couple of places where that could stand to get cleaned here a little bit. And this is just, you know, 30 and 40-year-old solder flux. Which a good quality alcohol will make short work of if you get enough of it on there. It's not perfect. I'll need to this Q-tip's already really nasty from cleaning up that other part, so not too surprised. You can also use some acetone. I've heard of people using that. I don't personally, because I just don't like the way acetone smells. I'm not a very big fan of the way alcohol smells either, but acetone's really harsh on the senses, I think. Anyway. Okay, so let's get to taking out some capacitors and replacing them. So I'm going to first open this bag up and get my capacitors taken out here. And I can already tell that I've got more capacitors. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's actually 5. I stand corrected. There's another one right here, a bipolar capacitor right here. which here's his replacement right here. That's on here. So really there's only like 5 capacitors that have to be replaced. But one of these for the power supply board. It's probably that one. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, well, they're all here then. I guess we're good. I thought I may have had an extra, but I'm just crazy. Okay. I'll go ahead and start with this bipolar capacitor because it's the first one that was there. I'll see if I can zoom in on this and get the detail a little bit better. So I got that capacitor replaced out. Next one I will do is going to be one of these guys here. Now according to this capacitor right here is a 25 volt 10 microfarad. So 25 volt. Alright, well these are 50 volt microfarads, but that's okay. The voltage meets or exceeds and the capacitance value is the same. Here's the deal. So the original holes here, I'll use these tweezers, for the original axial capacitor were over here. Oh, it's off camera. Were over here and over here. But there's other solder pads or unused vias that are kind of in the way. And my thought here is it would be better to just attach the positive lead of that capacitor to this unused via right here on the board, because it's right next to the other spot where it needs to go. So that would be a cleaner path, I think. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to solder over the original opening. It's always a good idea to apply some solder over pads you don't use to prevent any additional corrosion, not only on those pads, but from getting underneath the solder mask and potentially corroding it that way. Look at that. We've got ourselves a nice trace there. So should just be able to just put that capacitor like that. And then what I'll do is I'll fold it, I'll get it in there, I will fold it over. Actually, we're going to have to give it a little bit of room like that. So that it can sit where it needs to. Okay, that will work. Now we just got to get it soldered in place. Work. Move this over, and and hit this one from the other side. And the only reason why this is possible, by the way, is because this unused via is attached to the same point the other one was. Okay. Which, interestingly enough, is apparently ground. Okay. Happy with that. Get these pins off. Next one will be the one right next to it. And hit it with some fresh solder. Okay. Verifying the orientation for the negative lead. Because of course frequently when I desolder a capacitor, it will fall right off the board and I don't always catch which direction it was in. Okay, now this one's interesting in that there aren't any traces on the top pads at all for this. So all of the connectivity in the circuit for this capacitor is actually along the bottom. So it's interesting. So just shove it in there like that and solder it down. Okay. Get those clipped. And that's in place. Good to go. All right. Now, power supply board is next. Now the power supply board requires a little bit of slight modification, and it has to do with the same reason that I've talked about earlier, and that is because it has axial capacitors and I've got radial capacitors. So here's basically the gist of what I'm going to do. Again, this is marked just like the others. We can see that negative is pointing towards ground on both of these, which makes me think I need to double check one of my other Intellivisions now and make sure I do have that ground correct on that other capacitor, or that polarity correct on that other capacitor. So here's the deal. So these points over here, the negatives, will not be getting used, and that's because they're so far to the edge. And you'll notice that there is actually a ground plane. Those are shared on the same ground plane, and it runs all along the edge of this board. So here's what I'm going to do. These are the positive terminals for these capacitors right here. So the plan, and I've done this before, and this works really well actually, is I use a tiny little like a 1/16 drill bit, and I am actually going to drill 2 new holes side by side in this ground plane, along the rail of this trace for the ground. And that way I won't be using the holes over here. I'll have two new holes over here, and by doing that, that will allow me to use the axial or radial capacitors without having to do something really weird, just like stretching them all the way across. Now they'll still be spread out a little bit, but it'll work way better than doing the alternative, which would require doing something like stretching them way off to the edges like this or something, and having to attach it and then try to lay this down somehow. It just doesn't work very good. It's not very secure. So that's what I'm going to do. Now this is where my desoldering tools come in handy, or my soldering aid tools, I should say, because these are designed to scratch solder mask off of the copper, which I'm going to have to do because once I drill the hole through this, I'm going to have a point to solder onto, and of course it's not going to solder onto that green stuff. That solder mask isn't going to attach. So I have to scrape off the solder mask and go straight to the copper underneath. Just like that. So you can see there, once the camera focuses in, like a good boy. There he is. I've got two spots scraped away on the ground plane, and what I'll do is I'll use like my little 1/16 bit drill, and I'm just going to drill some new holes right into the center of those, and that's where the capacitors will attach through. It'll work out really well. Looking good. Okay, so I'm going to get my drill bit and I'm going to punch some new holes into this. I'll be right back. Okay, I am back and I have drilled my holes. See if the camera will focus in. Focus, you beast. There. So like I said, I just used like a 1/16 of an inch drill bit. It's a little bigger than the original via holes, but it gets the job done. And yeah, so now I can put those capacitors right in, and they'll fit better than they would have otherwise. So yeah, now they'll just go in like that. And that'll sit quite nice and secure, and I don't have to worry about stretching it all the way across and exposing the traces to a short. Now normally something wouldn't just short it out, but there are these little things called creepy crawly bugs, and I've seen them blow things up by shorting things out before, so it can happen. So yeah, so what I will do is I usually like to take these, bend them down. Let's see if I can get that to go like, there we go. And get this soldered down. Now cut that lead. Still a little sharper than I'd like. There we go. That's better. Then we'll get the other one in. See? Capacitor's in there nice and tight. It's not going anywhere. So, and then the same thing will be done with this one as well. It'll just go in through the original opening plus the new opening, and then I will also fold it down flat. So yeah, that ought to work just great. And that's it. We've got this thing capped up and ready to go. Okay, so I've got the console partially assembled, at least all the main components, with the new capacitors installed and in place. And it is powered on. And as you can see up here, I've got the controller test active for it, and that's because I was making sure that the controllers were plugged in the proper way. So because it is possible when you assemble and put all the cabling back into place, it is possible to put the cables in the wrong way, and then of course that would be bad. So yeah, that's a good start. I'm going to reset it. As you can see, it resets quite easily. There we are. Back to the LTO menu. And I'm going to test the music capabilities. So let's play some Super Mario 2. Alright, that's working. And then the other thing I usually do is I put it on this old Philly Classic trailer for this game, this demo of a game that I don't think ever actually came about, but it's just cool. It's just got some music. It's just called Castle. Like I said, I'm not sure what it's about, but it's a pretty cool little demo. It's got some cool little music, cool graphics. So I'll just let it sit here and burn in for at least an hour, making sure that making sure that it's working properly and that there's no problems. But it looks like the capacitor replacement at least is good to go.